Good morning, everyone. Um, so today's presentation has a very interesting title, a bunch of words that not clear how they relate to each other. It's heart attack, mortality, and chi therapy. It started like this. So about 10 days ago, I got a text message from a friend of mine whom I haven't seen for 20 years. He was actually one of the engineers that I hired into my first company, a company that I eventually left in 2002. And he was one of the perhaps 150 engineers that I hired into this startup. He was essentially a chief scientist. He's an interesting man. He was actually born and raised in Malaysia. He's not Chinese, he's a Malay. He himself said that he actually grew up in the jungle. He looks like the Jungle Boy too. He's a very rugged individual, very poor. He said he grew up climbing the coconut trees. He said that to me. But he's a very smart man and very hardworking, and overcame all adversities and managed to go to the big city and attended the national universities in Malaysia, just south of Kuala Lumpur, and then eventually came to the United States on a scholarship, earned both his master's degree and his PhD in, I believe it was in physics, if not electrical engineering. And then he joined our company. I really only know him for about a year and a half, because then quickly after that, I left. The text message he sent to me 10 days ago was actually after I already found out that he was following our practice on Saturday. And but the text message he sent was that he said he had just had a heart attack, but he wanted to thank me for the Saturday practice, because with his experience in mindfulness, he was able to stay calm and ride through the ordeal. I was really surprised by that. I didn't dare to ask him for more detail, because I didn't know if he was still in the hospital. But in any case, night before, I got another text message. Apparently he had returned home, and so he was giving me a little more detail. So this was his first heart attack, and he said it hurt so bad that it was as if his heart had jumped out of his chest, and the only thing that he could think about is what we practice on Saturday, which is feel the pain, accept the pain, let go of the pain. And so by the time the ambulance came and he was inside the ambulance, the medic asked him if he was still in pain. He said, "Oh yeah, lots of pain." And the medic says, but you look so calm. You're the calmest person I ever seen who's suffering from a heart attack. And then he actually talked about how during the procedure, where they put a balloon inside his blood vessel, he was actually awake. This is I don't know much about what they do in case of heart attack, but I know enough to know that it's essentially a microsurgery. So he was able to stay awake, and he was focusing his mind on his heart, and he kept encouraging his heart to continue and not stop, because he said he has a lot to do. So today's presentation is my gift and appreciation to my friend who has really given me a tremendous boost, spiritual boost. So it turns out that in America, every 40 seconds we have an heart attack. So we probably spoke for 5 minutes now, so that's a lot of heart attacks. So every year we have about 800,000 people who have suffered from heart attack, and a majority of them are the first time. 75% are first time, like my friend. Turns out most of them recover, but 20%, about 1/5 of them do die from this. It leads to something like cardiac arrest, and the heart will stop. Essentially, what it is some plaques, cholesterol plaques, are built up in the blood vessel. I actually had studied this a little bit sometime before when I was interested in inflammation. It turns out that it wasn't the plaque, it wasn't the cholesterol that is a problem, because our body actually do need cholesterol for our brain and other operations. So having cholesterol in our blood flow is not really the problem. The problem is that there's inflammation in the walls of the blood vessel. So essentially you have some scar tissues, and then the cholesterol will accumulate. But in any case, this is very common, and it's the last study says that United States have spent over $200 billion in 1 year for the treatment and recovery of heart attack, paid by either insurance company or by the government. That's a lot. I mean, even if you have 1 million people suffering from heart attack, that's $200,000 per person, which is about right. Because I know how much it costs to spend a couple of days to spend 1 day emergency and operation room and recovery room. That's a lot of money, and it's a tremendous health problem. And because it's such a big business for the medical and pharmaceutical industry, they don't ever encourage people to change their lifestyle. This is a big business. Why would you kill off the customer base? There was a survey that says that about 90% of those who suffer from heart attack consider it to be a wake-up call, because it was so painful, so dramatic, but yet somehow miraculously you survive. And it's essentially a lifestyle disease, so you can actually change it. And so most people, I'm sure including my friend, consider this event a life-altering wake-up call. And 80% of them says that their heart attack have affected them tremendously, both emotionally and spiritually. And 85% of them are living the remaining of their life as if they're giving a second chance. And I'm sure my friend is feeling the same way. So this being a wake-up call, it's also time for me to be a little bit more thorough in explaining our Saturday morning practice, what I've been calling the Chi therapy. So Chi therapy, to me, is actually a spiritual practice. It's not just exercise. And I'm going to spend perhaps the next hour, maybe more. This is going to be the longest presentation that I've done so far in really explaining what Chi therapy is. Because most people who've seen it for the first time, they recognize elements. They recognize the meditation, mindfulness meditation element. They even recognize what is now called the Vipassana meditation element. And of course, the Zen meditation is also part of that. And then there's the Tai Chi aspect, the sort of Taoist aspect, and some yoga aspect. So most people get very confused, and they don't know exactly where it came from. Well, it came from the source. It came from the source. And so I like to spend some time now to explain Chi therapy as a spiritual practice And from a historical perspective, going way back in the beginning, maybe more than 6,000 years, some even say 20 or 40,000 years, to someone who we refer to as Shiva. Now, Shiva is also known as the Adi Yogi, or the first yogi, the original yogi, right? So yogi, of course, is someone who practices yoga. But yoga is an American word. The original word is either yoj or yuja. It's interesting that if you there are two pronunciations for the word yoga in Chinese. The more modern is just yuga, which is exactly a translation from yoga. But the older version is yuqie, which is yuja, right? And it just means yoke. It's actually the word that they use to describe that piece of wood that they put in front of the two oxen as they pull the cart together. It's to synchronize the two oxen. So yuja or yoga as a spiritual practice is actually the harness between the mind and the body. Yuja itself just means the unification of the mind and body. Okay? So those who practice yuja is called yogi, and Shiva is considered the original yogi. Shiva is one of the three gods of the traditional Hindu belief. So instead of one god, the Hindus believe that there are three gods, dividing up the responsibilities. There is a Brahman. The Brahman is like the creator. That would be more like the Western concept of God. But he's the guy that creates the universe and all the inhabitants. There's a different God who is the preserver or the administrator. So in the Chinese tradition, that would be like the Jade Emperor. And then there's Shiva, who some people would call the destroyer. I'm not convinced that that's what it means. I'm not convinced that Shiva is someone who goes around and destroy everything just to spite Brahman, who created everything. I believe that Shiva is the one who thinks that everything comes together based on conditions. And when the conditions are right, they come together. When the conditions is wrong, then they fall apart. In fact, causality, the relationship between cause and effect, is perhaps the greatest destruction force. Nothing ever stays the same. It's permanent. So I believe that's really who Shiva is. Now I'm going to mention both Sati and Parvati, who is known as the first wife and the second wife of Shiva, who are actually the same person. But let me wait for that. And Sati is the Pali word that we use for mindfulness. This is very important. I'll come back to that. And in this case, Sati just means to remember. Now, Sati essentially passed away and reincarnated as Shiva's second wife. And when he came back as the second wife, her name is now called Parvati. And she was really the first student of Shiva, and encouraged Shiva to teach his knowledge. And Shiva eventually has 7 disciples. The 7 disciples actually went to the 7 corners of the world. And so there's a belief that all spiritual practice came from Shiva. All spiritual practice in all cultures somehow came from Shiva. And Shiva's knowledge boiled down to 3 things, something called shivas or koshas, something called nadis, which is chi basically in our language, and something called chakras, which is like the energy points. So first we're going to talk about the koshas, the shivas. So Shiva believes that we have multiple dimensions. There are multiple dimensions to existence, much like a Russian doll, one layer on top of another, on top of another. At the outermost layer is what we believe to be our body, but it's actually just one aspect of our body. Some people might call it the food body. There's nothing permanent about this body. Everything that constitutes this body came from outside of the body. There are food that we consume. If there's a banana in front of me, it's a banana. If I consume the banana, it becomes my food body, my physical body. And so we're like the people who borrow from the library. We have to return. So someday we return the banana back to the universe. So that's all it is. So this is the physical body. Now, inside that physical body is another body, which is also physical. It's the brain, it's the mental body, it's the intellect. Now, of course, in our Saturday practice, we call this one, and we call that rupa. This is the body, right? And then there's a inner layer, which is the bliss body. Okay, I'm going to jump all the way to here first, which is called the bliss body. So I remember we talk about nama, which is mind, right? So that's the metaphysical part. And so we talk about namaste, as in, may my light connect with your light. And so the bliss body is the light, is the innermost body, which is full of goodness. I use the example of the sun and the cloud. This is the sun. This is what shines. And then everything else is just the black cloud that covers the sun. And as a spiritual practice, our job is to emancipate ourselves, so we reveal the true self, which is the bliss body. Now, outside, covering that bliss body is something called the knowledge body. This is actually the cosmic memory of all our action. Somebody would call that karma, and I'll come to that. Now, what's between the rupa, the body, and nama, the mind, is the energy, is what the North Indians call nadi, and what the Chinese call qi. And Adiyogi Shiva believes that there are 24,000 qi channels, energy channels, half of them on the left side of the body, half of them on the right side of the body. Now, it's important to really clarify what qi is or what nadi is. So typically when we talk about qi in our Saturday practice, it's easy to think that, that's energy that is generated by our body. It's energy that is a result of the food that we consume. That's not true at all. The energy that we're talking about here is the energy of the universe that happens to pass through us. We are, in fact, a very integral part of the universe. To the extent that we want good health, we have to make sure that those energy pass through us unobstructed. That's why we do the Qigong exercise, is to make sure all of these Qi channels are open, unobstructed, so that the Qi, the energy from the universe, the yin and the yang energy, the energy from the sky and from the heaven and earth, can pass through us. And if the energy can pass through us, then having good health is a consequence of that. And so that's important. Now then, Shiva talks about the chakras. And of course, everyone who practices yoga will know that there are 7 chakras. But the 7 chakras is actually a subset of the 114 chakras, 2 of which are outside the body, 4 are kind of automatic. So there's really 108 chakras. Now the chakras here are not identical to the energy points that we'll be talking about later on. They're actually the intercept between these nadis. They're in fact the opening to a different, essentially time-space continuum. It is the window through which we gain awareness or awakening. So it's a very, very different concept. Okay. Now, of course, those 108 chakras, they're available to all beings, including the the very refined, very spiritually refined beings. So for the normal people, for the mortals like you and I who lives on earth, then we only have 7 chakras. Okay? Now, this was more than 6,000 years ago, if not 40,000. A lot has happened, continue to happen. And then Buddha, the historical Buddha, is about 600 years before Christ, about 2,600 years in the past. I'm going to come back and talk about that because this is a very, very important contributor to our spiritual practice. But just to complete this discussion on the traditional yogi practice, I need to jump ahead to about 4,000 year Common Era, 4,000 year AD. And someone named Patanjali. And for those who practice yoga, they know that the yoga that we practice today came from Patanjali. Now, I'm talking about the spiritual yoga. The American yoga I'll talk about in a minute, but I'm talking about the spiritual yoga as practiced in India today. Some people will call it the Patanjali yoga because there are 3 P's. One is Patanjali, is the name of the sage. And by spiritual, it means that we're separating our existence into what is called the cosmic existence and the earthly existence. So this would be physical and this would be metaphysical. And Patanjali was a yogi that lived in North India, as I said, about 400 to 500 AD. He's famous because he had written 3 very, very important books. The first one is called Yoga Sutra. It's the book on yoga. The second one talks about the Sanskrit grammar. It's still used today to describe Sanskrit grammar. And finally, the third one, and this is a little bit controversial. Some people think that he wrote it. Some people think that it's someone else who wrote it, but it doesn't matter. This is a very important book that talks about the medieval medicine, the medicine that's practiced in the ancient time, or what is now called, I believe it's called Ayurveda, right? But the most important part is that within the Yoga Sutra, he talks about the 8 limbs of yoga. The 8 limbs of yoga. And I want to make sure that we understand that our chi practice is based very, very much on the 8 limbs of yoga. And more, okay? But historically, this was the foundation for our practice, is the 8 limbs of yoga. So let me explain that. So the 8 limbs of yoga starts here. And in our case, this is what we call morality, right? Now, it's interesting that this thing here called yama is translated into English as in external disciplines. But then I said it's morality. So, for example, I talk about the precepts that I take as a Buddhist, the 5 precepts, which are no killing, no lying, no falsehood, basically, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, and no consumptions of mind-altering substance. So you might say, well, that's internal. That's your own thing. That's your own standard, ethical standard or morality. Actually, no. This is actually, we take these precepts in training how we deal with the outside world. We don't kill. This is how we deal with the outside world. We don't kill anything. We don't lie to someone. We don't steal from someone. We don't have misconduct, sexual misconduct, because of someone, your spouse, right? So actually, it is external, even though you're practicing internally. Whereas this next one, called niyama, is essentially our responsibility and duties. So, for example, if you're a Boy Scout, you're supposed to do one good deed a day. So this is how you would contribute to the world, much like I teach my Chi therapy classes on Saturday in English, and then the other 5 days in Cantonese. Now, even though that's done to the outside, we don't do that as a service. That's just something you have to understand, is that I don't practice on Saturday with you thinking that I'm contributing to you. I am, in fact, contributing to myself. It's a spiritual practice. It is actually what we call the Bodhisattva path. So there's actually a opposite of what you think, right? Finally, and then next is the postures, the asana. So in America, yoga is all about asanas, right? Different postures, different poses. Or then you might think, oh, that's just like when you sit, how you sit. Actually, the postures can be stationary or in motion. So stationary can be sitting, standing, lying down. And the postures in motion can be walking or doing exercise. So we actually practice different postures, and it all falls into this area called asana. Looks very different from yoga as practiced in America, but it's essentially one limb of the 8 limbs of yoga. Then we do a lot of practice on a breath. And then this one, whereas it's translated in English to be withdrawal of senses, we do that. We do a lot of that, but we don't withdraw. It's not like we want to put ourselves into a sensory deprivation chamber and lock ourselves out of the world. That's not the case at all. I call this the sense protocol, that we actually have to engage the outside world. Our eyes have to engage the sight. Our nose have to engage the smell. Our tongue has to engage the taste. Our ear has to engage the sound. And the body has to engage the touch. We call these 5 sensors sense door. And you are the doorman. So your job is to guard those doors. So there's a protocol when the external world comes to you, when the sound comes to you, right? That you would feel it, accept it, and then let it go. That's what a doorman would do, right? That's what a doorman would do. That when a guest comes, they want to make sure that they dress properly for the establishment. They greet them, right? They accept them, and then they let them go. They don't chase them to the elevators. That wouldn't make sense, because their job is to guard the door. So this is the part that we practice as well. And then finally, this is the part where we start to practice one mind concentration. So this is like when we sit and we observe a breath, right? We start with knowing a breath, know that we're breathing in, know that we're breathing out, and then eventually we work from that to the next state, where we have a continuous, what we call a continuous abiding, right? One after another, one at a time. And then finally you reach these 2 states. One is called Zen or jhana. Zen comes the word chan comes the word chana. Okay, it's all the same word. So that's a state of meditation. And then finally, ultimately, we come to the bliss. This is when those 5 sheaves basically all disappear and you are now in the inner core, right? So this would be where we would like to be, where my light greets your light. So these are the 8 limbs of yoga, and I just want you to know that we practice this. This is actually a fundamental part of our Chi therapy practice. Now, one word about the American yoga. The American yoga is something that actually appeared much later, only about 1,000 years old. And it's called the Hatha yoga. Hatha means force. It's very physical yoga. But interestingly, the history of that practice is that they believe that in order to have good health and longevity, that we have to preserve the essence of a body, and they call this the bindu. These essence are the fluid inside our body. Most important are the semens in a man and the digestive fluid. So they would go into great length to preserve those fluids, including fasting and inverted position, so that those fluid that comes from the brain doesn't drip out. And the man who practices must abstain from sex because they want to preserve the semens. You don't see any women practicing this in North India because they can, in that culture, they believe that women are inferior, not ideal, not suitable for hatha yoga. So it's kind of ironic that when it comes to America, we have more women practicing this than men. But in any case, now I will jump back to Buddha, and I will talk about Bodhidharma and somebody else. But I think it's important to talk about this particular person, who's many of you probably know. He's the Tong monk. He's the monk. The story about how he went to India, and his attendants were the monkey, the pig. Remember that story? Maybe not. It doesn't matter. So he's a very famous person. He's actually a real person. He's not the first. He's actually, according to historical record, probably the second monk that went to India by land. So he actually he can't cross the Himalayas. So he had to go all the way around through North Pakistan and then come to India. And what he did was he brought back a book, very famous book, called Yogacara Brahmi Sastra. And yoga is exactly what you think. Chara is the practice. Brahmi is the foundation of that practice. And Sastra, as opposed to Sutra, is written by someone other than Buddha. So this is translated to be the treatise on the foundation for the yoga practitioners. And it was translated and brought back to China by Yuan Zhang, who is the monk from the Tang dynasty. This is from the India Yogacara school, and it was written by a contemporary of Parajani, the person I talked about earlier about the 8 limbs of yoga. And so the yogic practice is very, very, very much part of the Buddhist practice. Okay, so now I want to go to Buddha and talk about what is it that unique about him, because Buddha, his name, his family name, his name before he was awakened is called Gautama. His name after he was awakened is called Sukamuni. He was actually a yogi. He had to be a yogi. He was born and raised in North India, and everything that he practiced up until when he was awakened was the yogic practice. He was born a prince, as many of you know the story, and he lived in luxury for 39 years. Because when he was born, his father consulted a sage, and the sage said, your son will either be a great king or a great sage. And so his father wanted him to be a great king, so he built a palace for him, and he didn't have to leave. But finally he left, and he saw the suffering of the people outside the palace, and he decided to renunciate and became a monk. Obviously not a Buddhist monk, because he was the Buddha, right? And he practiced as ascetic for 6 years. So I'm sure you have seen that picture of a Buddha statue where it's just skin and bone, because during that time he supposedly ate only 1 grain a day. And before he sat down the Bodhi tree and eventually became awakened, he actually had 2 yogi teachers. The first one, he was able to attain a state of the samadhi. Remember this 8 limbs of yoga, the final one is called samadhi. He was able to attain a state of samadhi called the sphere of nothingness. And in fact, he was such a good student that his teacher really wanted him to stay and volunteered to give him their entire school. He was not satisfied. He decided to wander around again, and he found a second teacher who's even better. And through practice, he attained even higher state of samadhi called the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. He was still not satisfied. And finally, he gave up his ascetic practice. He sat down the Bodhi tree, and he vowed not to leave until he found a way to reach the state of meditation that he wanted to reach. And after 49 days, he walked off the Bodhi tree. He was Buddha. Now, of course, by then, his 5 essentially bodyguards, because these are the 5 soldiers that the king has sent after him once the king realized that he had left the palace. And these 5 bodyguards became his follower. But when he gave up his ascetic practice, they thought he had given up, and so they left. And so when Buddha became awakened, he wanted to come back and find his companions. And he started teaching for 12 years the basic knowledge of Buddhism, and the knowledge that he had gained through his own self-awakening. And this period for 12 years is called the Agama period, because Gama means left, Agama means come back. So this is when he talked, when he went to this place called the Deer Park, and he waved at his companions and says, "Please come back, please come back. I didn't give up. I actually found a way." And this 12 years is all written in the Pali language. Actually, there were no language then. It was more than 600 years before they actually write it down in anything, and it was passed on orally from generation to generation. So, but today you can find all that teaching in what is called the Pali Canon, and I encourage you to study that. This is all of the what we call the Theravada monks, those who are from Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos. They all practice this. Okay? Now, so what exactly does it mean that he had reached these states of samadhi? So this complicated chart shows that. Now, this is, I'll come back to this. This is actually very, very scientific. But in any case, the Buddhists, actually not the Buddhists, the yogis, this is actually not, Buddha did not invent this. This is actually what was believed, what the belief of the North Indians in the traditional yogic practice. They believe that there's 3 spheres in a universe. We live in what is called the sense desire realm. And if you practice diligently, eventually you would achieve the first stage, which is called the jhana stage. And that's what I call the Chan or Chana or Zen. So Zen meditation basically is trying to elevate yourself from this sense desire realm into this rupa realm, the form realm, and it's separated into 4 stages, all of which are the jhana state. And if you continue the practice, then you go beyond that. Now you're in the A rupa realm. A means opposite. It's called a formless realm. And this is the samadhi realm. Although this is also called samadhi, so it's the 8th samadhi, except that this is also called the jhana realm. Jhana realm. And so when we say that the Buddha had reached the highest of the samadhi, that would be the 7th and the 8th. But he was not satisfied because he believed in samsara. He believes that even at these higher states, you would have to come back. And he wanted eternal life. So he wanted to be able to escape these 3 realms. And so when we say someone is awakened, someone who's a Buddha, it would be someone who actually have left, who was able to escape samsara, who's such a pure spiritual being that he was able to escape samsara. Now, we live in, I mentioned, we live in this realm called the sense desire realm. In fact, we are only one of the inhabitants of this realm. This is where the humans are. Now, the Buddhists believe that beneath the humans is the hell, is the hungry ghosts, is the animals, and something called asura. Above, a little bit more refined than the humans, are the devas, and they separate this into the 6 layers of the deva realm, the heavenly realm. Now, I'll come back to that. Okay, this is important. Remember this for now. This is very scientific. This is actually very, very scientific. Because Einstein predicted the same thing. You might say, what? What are you talking about? What did Einstein predict? Einstein came along after Newton and basically says that there's no reason for time to be absolute. Time needs to be relative. That's why it's called relativity. He believed that the only thing that is absolute in the universe is the speed of light. Actually, he didn't even call it speed of light. He didn't call it speed of light. He called it the speed of causality. He says the only thing that is constant in the universe, the only thing that needs to be constant in the universe, the only thing that has to be constant in the universe is the speed of causality. That means that if you're in one corner of the world and you did something, then the effect of what you did would propagate through space. It would have to propagate through space at the exact same speed everywhere in the universe. Otherwise, it would be contradictory. It will not be right. And then he says, so because, and all this is the exercise for his mind, because the speed of causality has to be constant, then the time cannot be constant. You can't have both. And so he predicted that the time would be relative, that every corner of a universe can have its own time. And so if you are anything that has a life or no life, it doesn't matter. Even a piece of rock can exist in the world. And a piece of rock would have a finite existence as well, right? Everything that exists in this universe would want to exist for a longer time. So they have a tendency to move towards another part of the universe where the time is longer, and that's called gravity. That's tremendous. So essentially he's saying that whereas Newton thinks that gravity is a force, gravity is not a force. Gravity is a consequence of the relativity of time. So once you do that, then you can divide up the universe in terms of its time. And so essentially what the Buddhists did is exactly that every step has a different time scale. And as you move towards a more refined, spiritually refined realm, your time is longer because you have less attachment to the material. Because the only reason that you would have time is because you have space. If you didn't have space, you wouldn't have time. So before the Big Bang, there were no space. So therefore, there were no time. After the creation of the universe, we now have space. Therefore, you need time. And if you have time, then you know the difference between material and non-material, because material it rises and it decays. And the more the material, the more attachment you have to material, the shorter the time, the less attachment to the material, the longer the time. So in Einstein's case, he understands that there is a region in the universe, a singularity in the universe, where time comes to a standstill. No time. No time means that it has the greatest gravitational force, because all living beings, all materials will want to move towards that. That's why we talk about the black hole. So the black hole is a singularity in space where time comes to a standstill, where all the gravitational force is so great that as soon as you get close to the horizon, the event horizon, it will get sucked in to this black hole and never come out. In fact, what happened is that the particle becomes energy. Okay? But the black hole is only half of the wormhole. So if you put two black holes together, there's a possibility for you to come in one side and go to another side. What material comes in becomes energy, energy becomes material again. So this becomes a way of making a shortcut through space. What's called wormhole. In other words, if you think of the universe as an apple and you have to go from one side of the apple to another, and you have to travel on the outside of the apple, it will take a long time. But if there's a shortcut, a black hole here and a black hole there joining, that would be a wormhole. Well, this was illustrated in a movie, one of my favorite movies, a movie called Interstellar, which is about 8 years old. The reason I get attached to this movie is because it's actually written by Professor Thorne, who was at Caltech during the time that I was at Caltech as a research scientist, visiting scientist. Now, he's a very brilliant man. He actually only recently received his Nobel Prize. His best friend is Stephen Hawking, and they work together. And at Caltech, we would see them all the time at the Athenaeum, which is the faculty club, where we have lunch. And after he retired, he decided he was interested in movie making, and he started to write scientific novels. And eventually he managed to get people to publish one of his scripts, which is the Interstellar. And everything about Interstellar is based on relativity and quantum mechanics. And Dr. Thorne and his students are also the technical consultants for all the special effects. And in this movie, there was a scene, a very famous scene, because the movie is all about the end of the world as we know it, and where Earth can no longer support life, and so they have to find a new Earth. And with the universe as immense it is possible to find another Earth, but it would be so far away that we will never get there. And so the only way you can get there is through the wormhole. That was the big part of the story. So in search of the Earth, they found a planet called the planet Miller. And the planet Miller happened to be very close to a Gargantua, which is a giant black hole, about 100 million times the size of the sun, or our sun. Because it was so close to the black hole, it had a different time. 1 hour on planet Miller is 7 years on Earth. And so they thought that they would just go down there and take a look to see if it was suitable for humans, beings. But they had some kind of mechanical problem, and they ended up staying there for 3 hours. And when they returned to their spaceship, their companion who left behind had aged 21 years. And so they were young man and woman, but his friend were a very old person. That was the story. Now, you go back to the chart I show you, this chart, where we're talking about sense desire realm, where we live. I talk about how what's underneath us. What's above us is what's called the Diva realm. And if you take a look at the Diva realm, we talk a great deal about the time. In the Buddha's teaching, we talk a great deal about the time, that every day on earth is equal to 50 years on the first layer of the realm, called for the four heavenly kings. The next one is where the Jade Emperor would reside, and so forth and so on. And so 1 hour on Muller's planet is 7 years, which means that 1 day will be 168. So they're not quite, they're close enough to the event horizon of the black hole in such a way that they're equivalent to in between these two realms. Okay? Very scientific. It's actually very, very scientific. So then the next question is, well, how do you travel? How do you do space travel without a spaceship? How do you go to this realm without a spaceship? You don't. You don't. But remember now, our existence is not just the body, right? It's the body, the chi, and the mind. So your physical body might not be able to travel, but your mind can. And so this again is very, very, very scientific. In quantum mechanics, we have something called particle wave duality. That is what we think of as a particle, as a material, can at the same time have wave behavior. Whether it's a wave or a particle depends on the observer. Now, if you talk to anyone who have any ability in deep meditation, he would be able to tell you, he or she would be able to tell you that. And I hear it many, many times. The person closest to me that I heard firsthand is Master Jiro, my Dharma master. That when I first met him, I have known him for 3 years. No, actually I've known him for 6 years now. Not counting, I forgot to count the 3 years that we got locked down. I know him for 6 years now. When I first met him and I learned meditation from him, he was talking about his experience when he was where he actually was living in a trailer for 3 years, where he wanted to go into deep meditation. And he talks about how one night he was doing meditation. The trailer is about 15 feet long, and he typically walked back and forth. And all of a sudden he lost time. He didn't even feel his body anymore. He felt like this energy just walking across. In fact, it was such a short time that he was wake up by this very bright light in his eye. And it turns out that his whole night was gone. And it was the sun shining through the window. So he talks about this how he could be in a different place. His body was doing one thing. His body was walking, I'm sure, back and forth all night long. But his spirit was somewhere else. And when if you ever attend a 10-day Vipassana class, which I did many times, and they would tell you that as you practice, you would start to see your skin as energy, and then eventually your muscle as energy, and eventually layer by layer, they disappear. They become energy, and they call this Brahma. And you can look up the sutra. So essentially, you can do space travel by leaving your body and becoming your inner body. Okay? All these are very, 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 very scientific. Now, ironically, today the scientists are looking for the unification between quantum mechanics and relativity. Buddha did it 600 years ago. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Buddha's teaching because I want this to be a gift to my friend, and I believe he's having a rededication to his spiritual practice. And so I want to leave some information so he can then study on his own. Everything that I talk about now is in the Pali Canon. The first thing I want to talk about is something called the 5 skandhas, which really describe our existence, but from a different way. So it starts with what is called rupa. Rupa is the physics. It's the physics, right? And it's the light, it's the sound, it's the taste, it's the smell, it's the touch. It's the physics. But we typically think of that as the seed of our mind, right? Because everything starts with something outside. And I'm going to talk about why that is not necessarily true. But that's how we think, right? When we become upset, it's because someone else have upsetted us. When we become happy, it's somebody else who make us happy. It's always outside that causes what's happening inside, right? So that's how we usually think of it. So we think of the physics, the outside world, as the beginning of everything. Then, of course, the sound comes to the ear, the light comes to the eye, and the smell comes to the nose, and so forth. And these are the physiology. These are what we call the sensors, the sense doors. Then once the eye reacts with the stimulus, then it creates an electrical signal. The eye creates its own electrical signal. All these are neurologies. All these nerve signals are combining in a spiral cord, right? So in my friend's case, when he's having a heart attack, he starts to feel the pain, and that's on his nerve. Now, of course, then all that is collected into his brain, okay? Collected into his brain. And his brain starts to recognize this, put the pattern together and say, oh crap, I'm having a heart attack. I'm feeling the pain, right? It's as if my heart is outside my body now. It continues because then he has emotions. So this is the end of the process as we know it. That you start with something, you end up with something. You start with a heart attack, and now you don't feel so good, right? And so these emotions can be good emotions, can be bad emotions. The bad ones are like what I call aversion. If you have any kind of pain, especially heart attack, the first thing you want to say is, I don't want this, I hate this. The second thing that's happened is that I was perfectly fine before. What happened? Why can't I go back to a minute ago where I was just fine? That's called attachment. You start to doubt. Now, fortunately, my friend didn't doubt. He believed in the practice, but normally you would, right? Even though you might practice and your instructor tells you how you should observe the pain and let go of the pain, you probably don't remember that, right? Don't remember the practice, that's you have doubt. Now then you fall into something called depression or the opposite, anxiety. So these would be the emotion. Now the problem is that these emotions are also the seeds, and they're left, a print of that is left in the karma. And from a scientific standpoint, it's actually quite easy to understand because everything up until now is electrical. And when you have electricity, you have magnetism. And when you have magnetism, you have storage. It stores it somewhere. The problem is that whatever you store in your consciousness, your subconsciousness, is also a seed. So it actually forms a feedback onto its own. Okay? Now the next thing I want to talk about is how that seeds actually create this destructive loop. Okay? And so this is what I mean by pain and suffering. All the way here is pain. That's physical. But once you recognize what you're doing, then it becomes suffering because that's all mental now, right? So let me explain this a little bit more. And again, the purpose here is to really give a summary of Buddha's teachings so you can study on your own. And before I do that, what happened is that the seed grows more seed, more fruit. Now, the scenario that I like to use is that, let's say you come to me and says, Denny, I'd like to grow some tomatoes. I say, oh, that's easy. I have tomatoes in my yard. Let me give you one. So you take the tomato, you bring it back to your yard, you split it open, in comes the seed, right? I didn't just give you a tomato, I give you a whole bunch of seeds that happen to be inside the tomato. So you take the seeds and you plant it. Now, if you plant it on a cement walkway, that won't grow. So you have to put it in the soil. So that means that you have provided some condition. But you have to continue to provide some condition, like watering it, giving it some fertilizer and so forth. Because if you didn't have seed, you wouldn't get fruit. But just because you have seed, you may not have fruit. You have to work on it. So eventually, you get a lot of tomato. A lot of tomato. You're happy. Suppose you go on vacation for 6 months. You come back. What happens? Your entire backyard will be full of tomato because each tomato contains seed and it continues to grow. All right? But what if I gave you a tomato that was actually bitter? Now you're gonna have bitter tomato. You will never stop from having bitter tomato. And that's what happens is that you feel the pain, you observe the pain, you let go of the pain, that's it. You feel the pain, but you get upset about the pain. You have negative emotion. So that's essentially like having very bitter seeds. That bitter seeds continue and it just gets more and more bitter. Okay? Now those seeds are what we call ignorance. The ignorance continue to fester in your mind and it starts to create a consciousness. Then it goes to the six senses to look for the right conditions. I give the example of someone who goes out and shoot little kids in the schoolyard. Who would do that? What did the kids do that created so much hatred in this person? They didn't, they couldn't, they won't. The hatred is in the ignorance. This person already have a lot of hatred seeds. And it's a matter of condition before they would exercise those hatred seeds. So this is a process. And then eventually there's contact. Then you have feeling, you have craving. That's the fruit. Okay? So our spiritual practice is about finding the point where we don't let it continue. We stop it. And that's what mindfulness is. That's what mindfulness is. So by mindfulness, what we try to do is we're trying to eliminate those ignorant seeds, which can be categorized into these 5 hindrances. And by mindfulness, there's these 4 foundations of mindfulness. Again, all of this is for you to study on your own. And you can study that by looking up what's called the Pali Canon. Okay? And there's the body, the mindfulness of the body, the mindfulness of the feeling, the mindfulness of the mind, and the mindfulness of Dharma. Now, the problem is most people who study the 4 foundations of mindfulness, they think that there are 4 aspects to this practice. And not only that, but they think that this is just the entry point and they want to get to this one as quickly as they can. That's not true at all. The word 4 never appear in the Pali Canon. The sutra is named Sati Patanya. That's it. It's the foundation of mindfulness. It's not 4 foundations. It's just the foundation of mindfulness. When Buddha taught the foundation of mindfulness, he had different audience, and each audience might be suitable for one way of achieving mindfulness. they don't need to practice all 4. They can practice 2. We actually practice only 1.5 because we believe that as human beings, we are not able to get to the mind until we relieve ourselves from the body. And so what we practice is the mindfulness of the body and the mindfulness of the feeling of the body. And so in a Saturday practice, we break it into 3 parts. The first part, the first sitting is about the mindfulness of the feeling of the body, right? And we separate those feelings into pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, and neither pleasant or unpleasant. And the trick is to feel it, observe it, accept it, and let it go. Whereas the last part is about the mindfulness of the body, and the existence of the body is in the breath. So we're doing mindfulness of the breath as part of the body. In this case, the mindfulness of the feeling is addressing aversion, especially when you have pain during your sitting, how to not have aversion during when you examine your pain. So my friend who was able to survive his heart attack is because he was able to put his aversion in check. He feel it, he accepted it, and he let it go. He never let it metastasize into suffering because he was able to manage his aversion. Whereas the second part, the last part, is about attachment. There's nothing you're attached to more than your breath, trust me. And so if you could give up your breath and let your body breathe on its own, which is what we do in the second part, then you are practicing on relieving yourself from attachment. That's what we do here, okay? All right. So, but one word, and I talked about this before, we in America, just like the way we deal with yoga, once we understand something, we have our own interpretation. So in America, people interpret too much into the word mindfulness. Mindfulness, when it was first translated into English in 1881, was just watchful mind. It just remember where is your mind. Keep checking your mind. Make sure that your mind is on your body when you're in motion, and make sure your mind is on your breath when you're stationary. That's all. It comes from the story. Sati is the name of the goddess who became the princess, and with the promise that his parents would never disrespect her. And when they disrespect her because they didn't like who she was married to, which was Shiva, they didn't invite them to the birthday party. And so Sati remembered that vow that they made. So she decided to burn herself so that she can then reincarnate into Shiva's second wife. That was the story. It's important to remember the story because Sati just means remember, or being very watchful of your mind, nothing else. Okay? Don't make too much of this, because if you, okay? All right, that's enough. Okay, so again, another illustration of mindfulness is this great movie that was just released a couple of months ago called 13 Lives, which talk about this instance that happens about 4 years ago in this cave in North Thailand, where there were 12 students and a teacher who were trapped into the cave, and there was a monsoon, and so they had to for survival, they had to keep walking into the cave to avoid the flood, and were eventually they got stuck. And when they were discovered, and then after 9 days, they were about 4 kilometers inside the cave. And when the divers found them, they were flabbergasted that they were still alive. 9 days with no food, no clean water, right? With no idea whether they're going to survive or not. But yet they survived. And the reason they survived, which was not talked about enough in the movie, was because the instructor was actually a monk. He was actually a monk, and he only came back as a householder because his maternal grandmother was ill, and so he came back to take care of his grandmother. And during that time, he became an assistant coach. So when he was inside the cave, they survived because the monk was able to teach the children how to meditate. And so let me show you this. This is exactly mindfulness meditation, how to be mindful of your breath. So, unfortunately, the clip that I added here, I did it for the students in Malaysia. So, the subtitle were in Chinese, so I had to translate it for you. So, basically, the monk was teaching the children how to do mindfulness meditation by maintaining mindfulness on the breath. So, he says, fear is created in our mind. The fear comes from the seed, those ignorant seeds in our mind. Okay? So close your eyes. Let your mind be at peace. Feel the air as you breathe in and as you breathe out. One breath at a time. Breathe in, breathe out, very slowly. That's it. That's it. They survived 9 days. My friend survived his heart attack. Mindfulness. Okay, so I promised this to be very long. It's hour and 10 minutes now, 11 minutes, but I want it to be complete. This is a gift. So now I'm going to talk about Qi practice, Qi therapy. Where does the Qi come from? How do we do what we do? Right? Because so far I really only talk about the traditional yoga practice and Buddhist teaching. But then there's a lot of, some people might call it Taoist element to this. So where did that came from? Well, that came from Bodhidharma, who was also a yogi. He was the 28th disciple of Buddha. He lived about 1,000 years, a little bit more than 1,000 years after Buddha. He came to China, and then he became the first patriarch of the Chan meditation, which is the Zen meditation, but he was also the originator of the Shaolin martial art. Okay. Then, about 300 years later, comes another person who's known as the patriarch of the Taoist practice. So I want to talk about the relationship between the Taoist practice and the Zen meditation, but more importantly, talk about Qi. How does the Chinese interpret Qi? Interprets the 74,000 nadis, right? Because that's the 74,000 nadis is the yogi practice. And how did that become the 12 meridians? So before I do that, I need to go back a little bit and talk about the difference between the Western tradition and the Eastern tradition when it comes to understanding of our universe. Now, there's a famous scientist called Galileo. He's the greatest scientist and probably the first scientist, as we know of today, of modern science. As you know, the Western history and the Eastern history are quite different. In the Western culture, you had this called the dark period, right? For the longest time, people were living under the absolute control of the church. And so people are not allowed to study the universe. People are not allowed to study science because the truth belongs to God. Right? Just open the Bible. What more do you want? But Galileo had curiosity, and so he invented his own telescope, and he was observing the stars. And as you know, the biggest star and the brightest star, and the one you can actually even see with your naked eye, is Jupiter. So he was studying Jupiter, and he was studying the moon, and then he was also studying the tide on Earth. He came to this conclusion that it's not the sun that is circulating around the Earth, it's the other way. It's the Earth that is circulating around the sun. And he wrote a paper. And that's heresy, right? Because the church says, look, it's written in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, that God created the earth first. He parted the water to reveal the earth, the soil. And then he created the light. He created the sun and the moon to give you the day and night. So he created the sun after he created the earth. So the sun would have to go around the earth. And they put him in house arrest, and he died. In mystery. And it was only after that people start to, that was the very beginning. It was very, very difficult, okay, to actually study science. Now the Chinese, on the other hand, were studying the sky, the heaven, for thousands of years, because they believed that the emperor is the son of heaven. So it would be okay to know more about, the homeland, the heaven. And so for the longest time, they have astronomers and astrologers. And for the longest time, they understood that Jupiter, again, the brightest and the biggest star in our universe, in our solar system, were moving around the sun. Everything moves around the sun. And it takes 12 years for every time that Jupiter goes around the sun. It would take 12 years. And that's how we invented the 12 zodiacs. Right? It takes 12 years to return back to where we started. And so I was born in the year of monkey, and someone else would be born in the year of the sheep. Then they realized that, no, actually, there's more than one star. Jupiter is the biggest one, but if you try hard enough on a cloudless night, you can see the other stars. So there's a total of 5 stars. So actually, it takes more than 12 years for everything to return back to the original configuration. It takes 60 years, 5 times 12. And so the Chinese actually have these 60 deities. And so it's not enough that I tell you that I was born in the year of the monkey. I was born in the year of the golden monkey. So these 5 stars, 5 planets, are the 5 elements. So Jupiter is the star of the wood, Mars is the fire, Venus is the metal, and Mercury is the water, and Saturn is the soil. I should have said soil. It's not confusing. And they actually believe that the 5 elements, I put them in quote because it's not elements as it is in the periodic table. It's actually 5 phases. 5. They believe that it's the 5, it's the balance, it's the harmony between the 5 that sustain life. Which again is very scientific. So if you think about what we're doing now in terms of wanting to find lives in the space, we look for water. Once you have water, it doesn't guarantee life, but it gives the possibility of life. Because the next thing you need is some kind of vegetation, algae, whatever. Once you have vegetations, you have you change the atmosphere. Now the sun would be exposed. It will warm up the earth. Once you have warmed the earth, then the algae or whatever vegetations would then become mineral, and then you have the mineral to add back into the water. Now you have more vitality, and you can grow higher forms of vegetations, and eventually the vegetation becomes animal. And so there's a kind of a generating a constructive effect between the five. Water helps wood, vegetation helps generates fire, helps fire helps earth helps mineral, and so forth. But if that's all you have, that's not enough, because you need to have a restraining force. What if you have too much fire? Well, then the water will restrain the fire. What if you have too much metal? Well, the fire can melt the metal. What if you have too much wood? The metal can cleave the wood. What if you have too much earth? Well, the wood can restrain the earth, right? Mudslides. What if you have too much water? You can build a dam with the earth and so forth. So you have this generating and restraining effect, and that's what yin-yang mean. That's actually what yin-yang mean. Yin is the restraining, and yang is the constructive. Now, this is a fundamental concept. This is actually something that is across the board in the Chinese culture, in the Eastern philosophy, to the point that they even use it to describe our internal organ. So they separate our organs into what's called the solid organs or the empty organs. The solid organs are the yin is solid because it contains the treasure. It's empty because it's actually the channel where the energy has to flow. The yin, this is yin. So the solid organs are yin, and the channel organs are the yang. The yin organs are the kidney, the liver, the heart, the spleen, and the lung. But keep in mind that this is not the same as the Western concept of the organ. That's why I put the organ in quote. It's not the organ as much as it's energy. It's only about 100 years ago when the two met, when the Eastern understanding and the Western understanding come together, and they translate the Chinese into they basically impose the Western meaning on the Chinese understanding of organ. And so when we talk about kidney, it's not just the kidney, it's the entire energy system that is named after the kidney. It has to do with a hormone. So it actually includes our adrenal gland and our thyroid, and it includes our reproductive system. When we talk about liver, it's not just the liver organ, but the energy that is named after the organ that also is responsible for the nerves. That's why we have these pressure points that we push that creates more energy into our brain. And when we talk about heart, it's not just the blood, it's the vitality. When we talk about spleen, it's not just the organ that you can cut away, and it's the energy system that we name after the spleen that has to do with the entire operation of our body. The operation that has to do with the digestion, the operation that has to do with the water circulating within the body, right? So the spleen energy actually includes our nimno, which is the one that returns water, and which is responsible for what is that called? The nimno, right? Nimno is part of our, what is that called? Immune system. Oh, sorry about that. And the lung is not just about breath, it's really about distributing the nutrients throughout our body. Okay, so these are energy lines that we name after the organ, but they're not just the organ. Now, once the Chinese understood meditation and they were able to enter into both jhana and samadhi, they start to see the energy in them, and because of their understanding of the solar system and how much of their philosophy is based on the sun and the absence of the sun, meaning the yin and the yang, and the five elements, the 74 nadis was abstract into the 12 meridians. And the 12 meridians actually is connected end to end. So for example, at 11 o'clock at night here, the energy line that we name after the gallbladder is active for 2 hours. And then the liver was active for 2 hours. Then the lung, so it actually becomes a continuous loop. It goes from one to the other. And the yin energy line is always from the extremities, the fingers and the toes, into the inner of the body. So the energy that we talk about is actually from the universe. It travels in our limbs, into both the hand and the leg, into our body. And the yang energy line is the channel energy line. It actually returns it back to the universe and so forth. And that's the chi. And this gentleman who was born a few hundred years after Bodhidharma came, learned the meditation technique from Bodhidharma. So he was able to experience the nadi and the 12 meridians. He is actually the patriarch of the Taoist tradition. The Taoists before Bodhidharma were alchemists. And so when we talk about Dan Tan, Tan is the field, Dan is the energy, is actually the pill. It's actually the pill that you swallow as a result of the alchemy. And when this person came along, they changes their entire practice from external to internal. The energy now is the energy within us. And so you can look up microcosmic orbit and see how that does. And we do that too here. So as a conclusion, it's hour and 30 minutes now. Chi therapy is actually a spiritual practice for the body and the mind. It's actually the spirit of yuja, which is the harness between the body and the mind. Our dimension's existence is the body and the mind and the chi. The chi is like the bridge between the body and the mind. Our practice consists of exercise, consists of mindfulness meditation, not all four, basically 1.5, mindfulness of the body and mindfulness of the feeling of the body. And in our Saturday practice, the first part is on the feeling. It's about learning how to deal with our aversion, one of those 5 hindrances. And in the second part, we're doing mindfulness of the breath, right? Existence of the body. Then it's about practicing on the attachment. Learn how not to be attached to even our breath. And a big part of our practice, so this is, you can think of this as a clockwise practice, and then the counterclockwise practice. The clockwise practice meaning going from the body to the mind. The counterclockwise practice would be going from the mind to the body, which is the middle part where we're doing a lot of stretching exercise, petting, and so forth. That's actually metta. That's loving kindness. Okay, so I hope this helps, and my best wishes to my friend, and my admiration to his courage, and also a great appreciation for him giving me such inspiration. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.